The moment the black SUV slowed to a crawl on Highway 17, Victoria Hale realized that the man she once mocked might be the only reason she was still alive. The road ahead looked ordinary under the pale California night, headlights stretching across empty asphalt, but something in the air had shifted, like the world itself had gone quiet before a storm. Inside the armored vehicle, Victoria sat rigid, hands clenched around the seatbelt as her security driver spoke in a low, urgent tone about a possible obstruction up ahead. Then it happened. The first impact echoed across the convoy, followed by the sudden burst of chaos as vehicles broke formation, forcing split-second evasive turns across the highway. Victoria's breath caught as the communication line cracked into static, then silence, even if only for a moment that felt too long to be real. "Stay inside the vehicle, Ms. Hale," her driver warned, but his voice carried strain, no longer fully in control of the situation. Outside, shadowed figures moved with coordinated precision between the tree lines, cutting off escape paths in a way that felt deliberate and calculated, not random. Victoria's mind raced through protocols, emergency contacts, contingency plans, and every scenario she had ever trained for in boardrooms that suddenly felt a world away from this darkness. None of them accounted for being trapped here, on an open highway, with nowhere to negotiate and nowhere to hide. Then, through the fractured light of shifting headlights, she saw something that made her freeze. A lone figure stepped out from beside a disabled truck parked half off the shoulder, as if he had been there long before any of this began. Oil-stained jacket, steady stance, calm presence that did not belong in the middle of this chaos. Ethan Carter, the mechanic she had dismissed months ago as insignificant, just another worker beneath her attention. For a brief moment, their eyes met across distance and disorder, and Victoria felt something tighten in her chest that had nothing to do with fear alone. It was recognition, and something worse, regret arriving too late to be useful. Ethan did not run. He did not turn away. Instead, he stepped forward into the open stretch of highway as if the danger had already been mapped out in his mind and accepted. Victoria pressed herself against the seat, whispering his name under her breath, unsure why it came out like disbelief instead of command. "Ethan," she said again, softer, almost involuntary, as though saying it twice might make him look back and reconsider. Outside, engines roared and tires screeched as the convoy attempted to reposition under pressure, voices shouting fragmented instructions that dissolved into the night air. And still Ethan Carter kept moving, calm in a way that felt impossible to understand, like a man who had already decided what mattered most long before anyone else realized there was a choice to be made. Victoria Hale pressed herself deeper into the seat as the convoy of black SUVs struggled to maintain formation on the dim highway, her pulse steadying only enough to notice how unreal the scene outside felt, like a situation her mind could not fully accept, even while her eyes confirmed every detail. Through the windshield, she saw Ethan Carter standing near the edge of the road, not moving in panic, not calling attention to himself, but observing everything with a calm focus that seemed completely out of place in the unfolding chaos around them. For a moment, she almost questioned whether her memory was playing tricks on her, because the man she had dismissed months ago in a quiet garage had never shown anything like this level of presence. Her driver spoke into the radio again, but the response was broken, distorted, and incomplete, leaving more questions than answers. Then Ethan began to move closer, not toward her vehicle directly, but toward the surrounding environment, scanning the road, the shoulders, and the positions of the stalled vehicles as if he was reading a pattern no one else could see. Victoria's instincts shifted from fear to something sharper, suspicion rising as she realized how coincidental it seemed that he was here at all, at the exact moment her convoy had been forced into a vulnerable position. When her vehicle doors automatically locked again after a brief system reset, she felt a tightening. Frustration mixed with uncertainty, because she was now completely dependent on the situation outside. Ethan reached the side of her vehicle and paused, not rushing, not speaking immediately, only meeting her gaze through the tinted window, as if waiting for her to process what she was seeing. Victoria lowered the window slightly, just enough for her voice to carry through the narrow opening. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone controlled but edged with disbelief. Ethan did not answer immediately, instead glancing past her toward the stalled convoy and the blind spots along the roadside, as though confirming something only he understood. "You should stay inside the vehicle," he said calmly, his voice steady and measured, without urgency or panic. That answer did not satisfy her, and instead it deepened her suspicion. Months ago, she remembered dismissing him during a meeting at her company's logistics facility, questioning his competence and brushing off his input as insignificant. Now he stood in front of her as if none of that mattered, as if the roles between them had shifted in ways she could not yet comprehend. Her driver interrupted, asking whether they should trust him, but Ethan simply raised a hand slightly, signaling for patience rather than obedience. He explained nothing dramatic, only that the road ahead had been compromised in ways that required a different approach than standard protocol, and that remaining in place would increase exposure. Victoria studied him carefully, searching for any sign of manipulation or hidden intent, but found only a quiet certainty that unsettled her more than panic ever could. Against her better judgment, she noticed that other drivers in the convoy were hesitating as well, reacting to Ethan's presence rather than ignoring it, as if his calm alone was altering the dynamics of the situation. For the first time since the convoy had left the city, Victoria felt her control slipping, not because of the external threat, but because of the man she had once underestimated standing just outside her door, acting as if he had already accepted responsibility for something she had not yet been told the full truth about. The tension inside the convoy seemed to stretch time itself as Victoria Hale kept her eyes fixed on Ethan Carter, standing outside her vehicle, still calm, still unreadable, while her mind began to fracture between the present uncertainty and something she had long buried beneath routine decisions and boardroom confidence. The silence between them outside the window felt heavier than the noise of the stalled convoy, and in that silence, her memory shifted without permission, pulling her backward to a different place, a different moment, when Ethan Carter had not been standing in front of her as an unexpected anchor, but as someone she had dismissed without hesitation. It was 6 months earlier at Hale Dynamics Logistics Facility, a place filled with polished glass, controlled lighting, and employees who moved quickly to match her pace. Victoria had arrived that morning already under pressure, reviewing project delays and supply chain projections. Her expectations set high and her patience set low. Ethan had been there in a maintenance capacity, assigned temporarily to inspect vehicle calibration systems for the fleet division, dressed in simple work clothing that blended into the environment of technicians and equipment. The first time she spoke to him that day, it was not with curiosity but with impatience, because she assumed his role required nothing beyond basic execution. She remembered walking through the facility floor with executives trailing behind her, pointing out inefficiencies in operations, when Ethan had quietly stepped forward to mention a potential adjustment in routing software that could improve fuel efficiency across their regional fleet. He spoke without arrogance, without urgency, only offering what he believed to be a practical improvement. Victoria had paused briefly, looked at him as if measuring the value of his input in seconds, and then dismissed it with a short response that ended the conversation before it could develop further. She had not raised her voice, but her tone had carried the weight of certainty that left no room for discussion, and she remembered the subtle shift in the room as others followed her lead. Later that same day, during a brief inspection near the service bay, she recalled another moment when Ethan had attempted to clarify a potential scheduling flaw that could affect delivery timing during peak demand. Again, she had interrupted him, this time more directly, reminding him that strategic decisions were not part of his responsibility. There had been no hostility in her words, only distance, the kind of distance that often came with authority and confidence. Ethan had not argued, not defended himself, not attempted to escalate his point. He had simply nodded once and stepped back into his work, returning to the maintenance tasks assigned to him, as though the conversation had never carried weight in the first place. At the time, Victoria had interpreted that silence as confirmation that she was correct to move on. But now, inside the stalled convoy, that same silence felt different in her memory, heavier and more deliberate. The flashback shifted again, this time to the final interaction before she left the facility that day, when she had passed him near the exit and offered a brief comment about sticking to his role if he wanted to remain useful. She remembered the way he had looked at her then, not offended, not angry, but simply observant, as if noting something about her that she herself had not yet recognized. In her memory, he had responded with only a few words, spoken calmly, suggesting that time often revealed what authority overlooked in the moment. At the time, she had dismissed it as meaningless, another vague remark from someone outside her world of decisions and pressure. But now, as she sat in a stalled vehicle on an empty highway with uncertainty pressing against every second, those words returned with uncomfortable clarity. The present and the past blurred as she looked again through the window at Ethan, realizing that the man she had underestimated was standing at the center of her current reality with the same quiet certainty he had carried months ago. And for the first time since the convoy had been forced to stop, Victoria Hale began to question not only what was happening around her, but what she had failed to see when she had the chance to understand him before everything changed. The convoy remained motionless on the dark stretch of highway as Victoria Hale slowly adjusted her breathing, trying to regain control over a situation that no longer responded to her authority or preparation. Outside her window, Ethan Carter continued to move with deliberate calm, now walking along the line of stalled vehicles as if mapping out the entire scene in his mind rather than reacting to it. Victoria noticed how even her security team had begun to shift their attention toward him, not with suspicion alone, but with a growing sense of reliance they were not willing to admit. One of the drivers spoke urgently over the internal channel, asking for direction, but no one inside the convoy had a clear answer that felt reliable anymore. Ethan stopped near the front of the lead vehicle, placing a hand briefly on the hood, as if confirming a detail only he understood, then turned his attention toward the roadside terrain. Victoria found herself watching him more closely than the situation itself, a realization that unsettled her because it meant her focus was no longer entirely on her own control of events. Her thoughts drifted again into fragments of memory, not of past conversations this time, but of patterns she had ignored in people she had once considered beneath her attention. She remembered how quickly she had judged efficiency over perspective, output over insight, and compliance over understanding. Ethan had been one of those she categorized without hesitation, placed into a role that required no further consideration once she believed she had assessed him. Yet here he was, in a moment where every structured system around her was failing to provide clarity, while he appeared to operate with a kind of quiet certainty that did not depend on approval or recognition. The convoy communication crackled again, this time more unstable, forcing brief pauses of silence that stretched uncomfortably between updates. Victoria lowered her gaze for a moment, pressing her hand lightly against the door frame as if grounding herself physically to prevent the rising uncertainty from taking over. Outside, Ethan raised his arm, slightly, signaling toward a secondary route that branched off the main highway, a narrow service path that disappeared into the dark outline of trees. There was no dramatic announcement, no attempt to persuade, only a simple indication that suggested a different path existed where others saw none. A few of the security personnel began to react, discussing the possibility of repositioning, while others hesitated, waiting for confirmation from Victoria that she did not immediately provide. That hesitation itself felt unfamiliar to her, because she was used to decisions arriving cleanly, supported by analysis and consensus rather than uncertainty and instinct. In that moment, she realized how much weight she had unconsciously placed on systems and hierarchies that now offered her no immediate clarity. Ethan returned to her vehicle once more, standing just outside the door, his presence steady but not imposing, as though he had no interest in taking control, only in ensuring that control itself did not become a liability. When Victoria finally lowered the window again, the air between them carried a different tension than before, less suspicion and more uncertainty mixed with reluctant acknowledgement. She asked him directly how he knew about the alternate route, expecting either an explanation or hesitation, but he simply replied that he had traveled this road enough times to understand what most maps overlooked. His answer was simple, but it landed in a way that made her realize how much of her world depended on information that was always filtered, processed, and presented rather than directly observed. As the convoy slowly began to prepare for movement toward the suggested route, Victoria remained still, watching Ethan as he stepped back into the darkness near the shoulder of the road. For the first time, She considered that the man she had once dismissed might not be an anomaly in her world, but a reminder that her understanding of it had always been incomplete. The convoy finally began to move again, inching forward along the narrow service route Ethan Carter had indicated, but the sense of control Victoria Hale usually relied on no longer felt intact, replaced instead by a quiet awareness that every decision now depended on conditions she did not fully understand. Through the windshield, she watched Ethan walk ahead of the lead vehicle, guiding the movement not with authority, but with observation, pausing occasionally to assess distance, terrain, and spacing as if every detail mattered more than anyone else had initially assumed. The vehicles followed in a slow, careful line, headlights cutting through the uneven darkness of the tree-lined path, while the main highway remained behind them like a sealed chapter of uncertainty. Inside the lead SUV, Victoria remained silent, her thoughts no longer focused on corporate strategies or emergency protocols, but on the strange disconnect between what she had always believed about control and what she was now witnessing in real time. Her security team continued to communicate in short bursts, confirming that the alternate route was stable, but even their tone had shifted, carrying less certainty and more quiet acknowledgement that Ethan's guidance had been unexpectedly accurate. Victoria studied him through the windshield as he moved, noticing small details she would have ignored in any other context, such as the way he paused before turning corners and the way he seemed to listen to the environment itself rather than the instructions of others. There was no performance in his actions, no visible need for recognition, only a steady focus that felt both unfamiliar and unsettling in its simplicity. As the convoy progressed deeper along the route, Victoria's mind returned once more to her earlier dismissal of him, not as a dramatic regret, but as a slow recognition that she had consistently misread competence when it did not present itself in expected forms. She had built her career on identifying efficiency, yet she now realized how often she equated confidence with competence and visibility with value, leaving gaps in her judgment that she had never been forced to confront until now. The vehicles passed a bend where the trees briefly opened into a wider clearing, and Ethan raised his hand again, signaling a brief pause. The convoy slowed immediately, responding without hesitation this time, as though his presence had already been absorbed into their chain of trust. Victoria noticed that no one questioned the instruction, not even her senior security officer, who simply nodded and relayed the signal forward. That realization unsettled her more than anything else so far, because it meant the authority she was accustomed to was no longer the primary force guiding the situation. Ethan approached her vehicle again, his expression unchanged, and for the first time, she noticed exhaustion beneath his calm demeanor, not physical strain in a visible sense, but something deeper, like someone who had carried responsibility long before being asked to explain it. When she asked him how much further the route would take, expecting a logistical answer, he instead told her that they were already closer to safety than they had been on the main highway, but only if they continued to move carefully and without hesitation. His words were not dramatic, yet they carried weight because they were not delivered as reassurance, but as fact. Victoria looked past him toward the convoy stretching behind, realizing how easily everything she controlled could have collapsed without the presence of someone she had once dismissed without thought. For a brief moment, she considered asking him more about himself, about how he knew these routes, about why he had been on that highway at exactly the right time, but she stopped herself, uncertain whether she was ready for answers that might further challenge her understanding of him. Instead, she simply nodded, allowing the convoy to continue forward under his guidance, while the distance between what she believed she knew and what she was beginning to understand grew quietly wider with every passing mile. As the convoy continued deeper along the service route, the landscape around them began to shift from open highway tension into a quieter stretch bordered by sparse trees and industrial fencing, where the sound of engines felt less like urgency and more like controlled movement guided by something unfamiliar yet stable. Victoria Hale remained seated in silence, but her attention was no longer divided between fear and logistics, because her focus had narrowed entirely onto Ethan Carter, who still moved ahead of the convoy with the same measured calm as before, occasionally pausing to scan distances and angles that seemed invisible to everyone else. The security team inside her vehicle had lowered their voices now, their earlier uncertainty replaced with a cautious trust they did not openly admit, as each of Ethan's instructions had so far aligned perfectly with the unfolding conditions. Victoria noticed this shift not only in them, but in herself, because she was no longer evaluating whether to trust him, but instead trying to understand how she had failed to recognize his capability in the first place. The convoy passed beneath a partially lit overpass where shadows stretched long across the asphalt, and Ethan signaled another controlled slowdown, raising his hand with a subtle motion that carried more clarity than any radio instruction. The vehicles complied immediately, forming a tighter formation as they moved through the narrow passage. And for the first time, Victoria realized how quickly people adapted to certainty when it was presented without hesitation. Her mind drifted again, not to fear, but to analysis, replaying every interaction she had ever had with Ethan Carter, searching for inconsistencies she had missed. She remembered how he spoke only when necessary, how he never attempted to position himself above others, and how his suggestions always carried a practicality that she had mistaken for simplicity. Now, in this environment where complexity had failed her systems, that same simplicity had become the only thing keeping the convoy stable. As they exited the underpass, the road opened into a quieter stretch, and Ethan finally slowed his pace, allowing the lead vehicle to draw closer to him. Victoria lowered her window slightly again, watching him as he approached, and for the first time she noticed something different in his expression, not confidence, but recognition of something he had anticipated long before it became visible to others. She asked him directly how he had known about the route and the timing of their movement, expecting another simple explanation, but his answer came with a calmness that suggested experience rather than prediction. He told her that certain patterns in movement were not random if you understood how systems reacted under pressure, and that most disruptions followed predictable behaviors when observed closely enough. His explanation was not technical in a way that required expertise, but observational in a way that required patience, something Victoria realized she had rarely allowed herself to develop in situations of urgency. For a moment, she looked at him differently, not as an employee or an outsider, but as someone whose understanding of the world operated on a layer she had consistently overlooked. The convoy resumed movement, but now at a steadier pace, and Ethan stepped slightly aside to allow the lead vehicle to pass him, continuing alongside instead of in front, as if his role was not to lead but to ensure continuity. Victoria watched this adjustment carefully, realizing that he had never attempted to position himself as authority, even when others had begun to follow him instinctively. The further they traveled, the more she understood that his presence was not defined by command or recognition, but by reliability under conditions where both had failed. And as the convoy moved toward what now appeared to be a safer corridor of road ahead, Victoria Hale found herself confronting a thought she had long avoided in her own life, that competence was not always visible at the surface, and that the people most capable of guiding others were often the ones who never asked to be followed at all. The convoy continued along the quieter corridor of road, where the tension of earlier uncertainty had begun to settle into a slower, more controlled rhythm. Yet Victoria Hale still found herself unable to fully release the awareness that nothing about this situation had been ordinary from the beginning. Ethan Carter remained close to the lead vehicle now, no longer acting as a distant guide ahead of the convoy, but instead walking alongside its progression at a steady pace, occasionally glancing toward the line of vehicles to confirm spacing and consistency, as if he carried responsibility without ever being formally assigned it. Victoria watched him through the slightly lowered window, noticing how his presence no longer felt like an external variable, but something the convoy had quietly adjusted around, as though everyone had unconsciously accepted his judgment without needing confirmation. The security team inside her vehicle had stopped debating instructions altogether, now responding directly to his subtle signals with a level of ease that unsettled her more than it reassured her, because it revealed how quickly trust could form when competence was undeniable. Victoria shifted her attention away from procedural thinking and allowed herself, reluctantly, to observe Ethan not as a contractor or an unexpected participant in a crisis, but as a person whose behavior did not align with any assumptions she had made about him months earlier. There was a stillness in him that did not feel like detachment, but rather control refined through repetition and experience, the kind that did not require external validation to remain stable. As the convoy passed another stretch of open road bordered by low fencing and distant industrial lights, Ethan slowed and approached her vehicle once more, not with urgency, but with the same measured calm that had defined every one of his movements since she first saw him on the highway. Victoria lowered the window fully this time, no longer hesitant, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke, as if the silence itself had become a necessary part of understanding what had changed between them. Ethan eventually broke the silence by asking if the convoy was maintaining stability, not in a way that suggested doubt, but in a way that confirmed he was still tracking conditions beyond what the visible environment offered. Victoria nodded, then surprised herself by asking him how he remained so composed under pressure, expecting a technical explanation or a reference to experience, but instead receiving something simpler and more human. He told her that control was never about eliminating uncertainty, but about recognizing what could still be influenced when everything else was unstable. The statement lingered in the space between them longer than she expected, not because it was complex, but because it challenged the foundation of how she had always defined leadership and decision-making. For a moment, she looked past him toward the convoy stretching behind, realizing how dependent they had become on his judgment without ever formally acknowledging it. She thought about the way she had once spoken to him at her facility, how easily she had reduced his input to something unnecessary, and how that same person was now the reason her current reality had not collapsed into disorder. Ethan took a step back, preparing to continue walking alongside the convoy, but paused briefly as if considering something he had not yet said. When he spoke again, his tone remained even, but there was a subtle shift in weight, as though he was no longer speaking only about the road ahead, but about patterns he had seen long before this moment. Victoria listened without interrupting, realizing that for the first time she was not evaluating his words for utility, but for understanding. And as the convoy continued forward into the widening stretch of road ahead, she became aware that something within her perception had begun to shift quietly, not through dramatic revelation, but through the slow recognition that the man she had once dismissed was not simply guiding her through a difficult situation, but revealing how much she had never truly seen in the first place. The convoy had now entered a long stretch of road where the surrounding environment felt more open, with distant lights from industrial buildings fading into the background and the sound of engines becoming the only constant rhythm guiding their movement forward. Victoria Hale remained focused on Ethan Carter, who still walked alongside the lead vehicle with a steady pace that matched neither urgency nor hesitation, but instead reflected a controlled awareness of everything happening around the convoy. For the first time since the situation began, there was a sense that the immediate uncertainty had passed, replaced by a quieter tension that came from not knowing what had caused the disruption in the first place. Victoria noticed that Ethan was no longer scanning the road in sharp intervals, but observing it in a continuous way, as if the danger had not disappeared, but simply moved beyond visible range. The convoy maintained formation without issue, and even the communication channels, which had been unstable earlier, now operated with fewer interruptions, though no one inside the vehicle spoke with complete confidence. Victoria studied Ethan through the windshield as he moved slightly closer to her vehicle again, and this time she did not lower the window immediately, instead waiting as he matched pace with the convoy, and signaled a gradual deceleration near a wide junction where multiple routes converged. The vehicles responded smoothly, slowing in unison, and the entire formation shifted without hesitation, following his direction as though it had become the natural point of reference. Victoria finally lowered the window and asked him directly if they had cleared the most unstable part of the route, expecting a simple confirmation, but his answer came with a measured caution that suggested awareness of conditions beyond what they had already passed. He told her that stability on the surface did not always mean the absence of risk, only that movement had shifted into a less predictable phase. The statement did not alarm her in a dramatic way, but it changed the way she observed the environment around them, making her realize how much of her earlier confidence had depended on visible reassurance rather than deeper understanding. As the convoy continued through the junction, Ethan paused near her vehicle longer than before, and for the first time Victoria noticed a subtle change in his expression, not tension, but something closer to reflection, as if he was considering whether to reveal information he had not yet shared. She asked him what he meant by less predictable phase, and instead of giving a direct explanation, he looked toward the converging roads and said that systems often appeared calm right before they revealed their true structure, especially when multiple variables had been forced into alignment under pressure. Victoria felt a quiet shift in her perspective as she processed his words, realizing that he was not speaking about the immediate situation alone, but about patterns that extended beyond this moment. Her attention briefly moved from him to the convoy behind, where every vehicle now followed with consistent spacing and reduced hesitation, and she recognized that their behavior had changed not because of formal instruction, but because of observed reliability. Ethan stepped back slightly, preparing to continue alongside the convoy, but hesitated for a brief moment, as if weighing whether his role should remain limited to guidance or expand into something more direct. Victoria noticed this pause and found herself no longer evaluating him as an external contractor, but as the central point of stability in a situation that had once been entirely under her control. The convoy began to move through the junction smoothly, lights reflecting across multiple lanes as the path ahead opened into a wider corridor of road. Yet the sense of uncertainty did not fully disappear. Instead, it transformed into something quieter and more persistent, as Victoria Hale began to understand that the true challenge was not what they had already passed through, but what had yet to reveal itself beyond the reach of immediate visibility, and Ethan Carter remained the only presence moving with certainty through both. The convoy moved steadily through the widened corridor of road, the headlights of multiple vehicles stretching forward like a controlled stream of light cutting through the calm night. Yet Victoria Hale no longer interpreted the environment as simply safe or unstable, because her understanding of what safety meant had begun to shift since Ethan Carter had entered the center of their reality. He was still moving alongside the lead vehicle, but now his pace was slower, less directive, as if the critical phase of navigation had passed, and what remained required only maintenance of stability rather than correction of direction. Victoria observed him closely, noticing how he occasionally glanced toward the convoy not with urgency, but with quiet confirmation, as if checking that what he had already set in motion was continuing without deviation. The communication channels inside the convoy remained steady, and even the security team had relaxed slightly, though their attention still lingered on Ethan whenever he appeared near the window of her vehicle. Victoria found herself reflecting less on external threats and more on the internal realization that her earlier perception of control had been incomplete, shaped more by structure than by adaptability. The road ahead was now clearly marked, with reflective signage guiding them toward a major interchange that would lead back toward secured routes, and the convoy's formation remained intact without further instruction. Ethan slowed further and approached Victoria's vehicle one final time, his presence no longer signaling adjustment but closure of the immediate uncertainty that had defined the last several miles. She lowered the window, expecting a final instruction or confirmation, but instead received a moment of stillness where neither urgency nor explanation was necessary. He looked toward the convoy behind them, then back at her, and for the first time there was no assessment in his expression, only a quiet acknowledgement that the situation had stabilized beyond immediate concern. Victoria asked him if everything was now under control, and he replied that control had never been the correct measure, only awareness of how long instability could persist before it resolved itself naturally. The answer lingered in her mind longer than expected, because it reframed everything she had experienced since the moment the convoy was forced off the main highway. She realized that what she had interpreted as guidance was not leadership in the traditional sense, but an understanding of flow and timing that operated outside her usual frameworks of decision-making. The convoy passed the final convergence point of the route, merging smoothly onto a broader, well-lit roadway where traffic signals and infrastructure returned to familiar patterns, and the sense of immediate uncertainty finally began to fade. Ethan stepped slightly away from her vehicle now, no longer pacing alongside it, but simply standing at the edge of the road, as if confirming that the transition was complete. Victoria watched him carefully, noticing how he no longer seemed attached to the convoy's movement, as though his role had always been temporary rather than permanent, activated only by necessity rather than circumstance. As the vehicles continued forward without disruption, she remained looking at him longer than required, realizing that nothing about this experience had been about rescue in the way she originally assumed, but about recognition of patterns she had overlooked in both systems and people. Ethan gave a final subtle nod, not as farewell, but as acknowledgement that his part in the sequence had ended, and then stepped back into the dim edge of the roadside lighting, allowing the convoy to continue without him. Victoria did not speak as he disappeared from view, because for the first time she understood that the most important change had not been in the road they traveled, but in the way she now perceived the people she had once failed to see clearly. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more stories of courage, kindness, and second chances, because the people the world overlooks often leave the greatest impact.